want to talk about some of the cultural changes that we've seen in society. Specifically, I want to ask Stephanie, like, what changes have you seen? Because you've been around for a long, long time, and I want to know, like, what have you observed? Have you seen change, and what changes? What have you seen?
I think we touched on a lot of this in the previous segment. I think
Yeah,
we touched on I'm spacing on
is it getting better for
uh,
trans folks?
yeah, it is. I mean, the media, popular media, not necessarily, not the news media, but popular media
Yeah.
has gone from uh, uh, a place of parody to a place
Mm.
of um, to a place of embracing, um, with some degree of compassion, trans subjects. As I
Yeah.
mentioned to you guys earlier in the pre-show, I'm probably the only trans person on the planet that hasn't watched any of the Matrix. But uh, so, but you're seeing things like on the CW, Supergirl, for example, Natalie Maines. She's a Maine kid. She was actually the focus of a lawsuit at her high school, allowing
Hmm.
her to use the proper facilities. I mean, she's a tremendous actress, and they wrote the character of Dreamer with her input, and so things like this, where you have where you have a bit more of a compassionate view. Jen Richards in the reboot of Tales of the City, playing playing the character of young Anna Madrigal and filling in the backstory there, was so well done, and it was played by a trans actress. Uh, so in the media landscape, in the entertainment landscape, it's no longer a situation where we're parodied, where
Hmm.
we're caricatured. There's far more um, compassion and more involvement in trans people playing trans characters, which I think is tremendously important from the role model aspect of like uh, young trans people saying, "Hey, it's possible to uh, uh, to realize a life, um, and have the aspirations that every cis child has. The possibility of realizing those aspirations as who you are." I think that's super important, and I do think that is a major change. Um, as far as the news media is concerned, as far as politics is concerned, it's ebbed and flowed, and right now it's on an ebb. To be honest, I mean, in
Yeah.
27 states, there are bills
Yeah.
uh, right now being introduced that will take away my rights, that will take away the rights of trans kids. The reason I ripped off the mask as in 2018, as I just sort of I had a certain amount of passing privilege, and hid behind, didn't talk about trans issues on social media at all. The reason I ripped off the mask and said, "Hey, I need to a uh, change my display name on Twitter and declare this stuff and tell people on Facebook about this stuff," is because the Trump administration uh, wanted to the HHS wanted to enshrine into uh, administrative law that sex is immutable, and assigned at birth. And what that means in as practical matter is that you can't change your passport.
Yeah,
You
you're
can't
locked in.
change your birth
Yeah.
certificate. You can't. And when people start talking about identity politics, I don't know how uh, how much more identity politics you can get when you're requiring identity documents to say that you are something that you are not. And that's where I started getting a little bit off the wall. And I used every contact and every means in my power to express that to people who could make a difference. And thankfully, that policy was still on the table when the prior administration left, but they left without ever implementing that. And for that, I'm very happy.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to hear you talk about how like the growth in some of like the TV entertainment media. Because I remember like for me when I was growing up as a kid, the representation that I had of trans people was like Jerry Springer. You know, like, oh, my boyfriend just found out I'm really a man, and now we're gonna fight, and people are gonna like cheer it on.
And it's always framed that way.
Yeah.
My boyfriend found out I'm really a man.
Yep. Yep.
Or it was maybe the person involved didn't say that, but that was exactly how it was billed
Yep.
on the shows. I mean, it's there's I think one of the I was just about to say one of the queer things about portrayal in the media uh, is the titillation factor of how peculiar is this? Why would anyone try to? Why would anyone want to do this? And it's just sort of it's out of the ken of most folk to imagine this part of the human experience, and that is because it's not particularly common, and it's just not something people come across. So it makes it's the stuff of of parody, and it's the stuff of and it's also, to be honest, um, uh, the whole gender bending notion of stuff
Yeah.
is is something that captures people's imagination, and it sells.
Yeah, for sure. Um, it kind of I know we touched on this like a little bit in the last segment too about like how there used to be the Harry Benjamin standards, but one thing I think is I'd really like to hear your take on is how like the science has changed. Kind of maybe a little bit of a deeper dive into that, like the
Wow.
our understanding scientifically of transness. I think that is yeah, really curious. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I'm a sailmaker, not a physician, or a psychologist. I
Sure.
make sails for a living. It's like I sail sailboats, race sailboats for a living. I I don't I don't claim to have an in-depth knowledge of stuff, but I think that um, the medical profession has looked more carefully at the actual science and the actual experiences of trans people, and has come to understand that we're pretty diverse, and it's not just simply based on gender role. It's more based on gender identity than gender role. And back in the day,
Mhm.
it was far more based on well, if you want to be uh, um, the opposite sex, as they would have it then, and I'm sort of relying on old style thinking,
Mm.
then you must do X, Y, Z. and conform to the gender role. And part of the diagnostic was, well, what kind of toys did you play with? What kind of, who are your
Right.
friends? Who's this? And it was viewed from the overarching perspective of mostly cis het white guys.
Yeah.
They're the
So
worst.
it was patriarchal from the get.
Yeah.
And with a singularly focused lens that, well, you can't possibly be. You'll need to prove that you can that you can play the role. But as I said way back, it was never about the clothes, and it's not ever about the clothes necessarily. For people like me, sometimes it is, but it's not. It never was for me. I grew into appreciating the
Right.
the expression.
Not it's
I don't know.
not
Does that
about the
answer your
clothes in a way
question?
that separates you from like the way a cis woman cares about clothes, or might
Right.
care about clothes, or might want to play
Exactly.
with her gender expression. Right, exactly.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for
It's
sure.
just about who you are. It's not. You play around with stuff until you figure out how to dance.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Awesome.
absolutely. I mean, we are running a little behind, and we're like, oh, we have 20 minutes to go. We have a couple of callers that I think we should really get to, because they're like, these are going to be great calls, and I feel like we want to talk to folks. But before we get to those calls, one last question: what can cisgendered white men like me, do to help be an ally to your cause? How can we
Um,
help you?
Oppose those bills. Oppose those bills. Oppose societal legal restrictions on our ability to be ourselves. Make your voices heard. Don't tell me there's so many people that told me back in 2018, we have your back. Uh,
Right.
you know, no, you don't, and no, you still don't, because these things are still getting passed in Tennessee, in Arkansas, in Texas. There was even a bill in my own state that had no chance of getting through the legislature, but nevertheless, there's these things are being introduced. They're being introduced for a reason. They're being introduced because of what I was talking about, that it's titillating. It scares people. Trans, that the very idea of it strikes people in their souls in a very visceral way. And until they know a trans person, until they have had an opportunity to see that, hey, these people are real people, and by passing this sort of legislation is going to hurt them, it's very difficult for us to make the case. So what cis people can do, especially what y'all can do, is really support us. Don't just talk it, walk it.
Well said. Well said.
Absolutely.